I have a confession to make. I fear I enjoy painting Warhammer minis more than I enjoy playing the game. Oh, my Thunderwolf Cavalry looks like my dog. Buddy, look, it's your twin. Oh, so handsome. As it turns out, I have neither the attention span to measure the distance between tiny dudes for 4 hours, nor do I have the brain space to memorize a new codex of rules every 3 to 4 years. That said, I do really enjoy Warhammer as a setting and really like the lore, so when I learned that there was a new faction coming out, I was really excited. And when I feel excited, I feel called to have an opinion on the internet.
This is Grand Cathay, our eternal empire.
Now I know Grand Cathay is not new to Warhammer the Old World lore, but it is new to the tabletop, and this is the first time that they've had an actual playable set of figures. As you can probably guess from the name, Cathay being an archaic name for China arising around the 11th century in reference to the Khitan people who ruled the Liao Dynasty in northern China from 916 to 1125 CE, Grand Cathay is largely based on Chinese culture from the late Middle Ages, and the visual design of its units very clearly evokes that inspiration. But what features specifically are creating that impression? Well, you might say to yourself, Ellie, I have eyes, and I can tell that it is Chinese inspired from the way that it is. Today, I want to enumerate the symbols that we have come to associate with Eastern material culture. Which of these tropes are invented and which are rooted in reality? As ever, my goal is not to measure fantasy against historical accuracy as some sort of purity test, but rather to challenge us to interrogate the meaning behind design. In settings so clearly based on real history, how do invented elements enhance or detract from the richness of these fictional cultures? When does a fantastical departure add visual impact or depth? And when is it just sort of meaninglessly wrong? For the purposes of our discussion, I'm going to focus on the tabletop miniatures that were announced in the latest Warhammer community post. Sorry, Total War fans. So let's get into it. Let's start with looking at the Jade Warriors, which are the core unit of this faction. They successfully give the impression of East Asian soldiers, but there are a few different cultural influences and time periods at play here, so let's unpack it piece by piece. Perhaps the most immediately impactful design decision to note here is that these guys are wearing scale armor. While Western European armor of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance is probably the most common inspiration for fantasy designs today, plate harness is actually quite an outlier, with most of the world using hide, scale, lamellar, laminar, or brigandine armors throughout history. So this visual choice firmly places this faction outside of early modern Western Europe in time and place, which helps distinguish Cathay from other Warhammer the Old World factions on the table. Now, the silhouette of their armor is very evocative of East Asian style specifically, where long protective coats were the norm. If I had to place this kit in time, I would call it vaguely 10th to 13th century Chinese, when warfare was dominated by the heavily armored cataphracts of the Song, Liao, Western Xia, and Qin dynasties. I will say lamellar armor would be more period accurate than scale here, where the hard chips of material would be laced to each other rather than attached to a backing as they appear to be here. But since this faction is ruled by dragon lords, I actually do think this scale adds some nice narrative depth. But their armor also incorporates elements from the later Ming Dynasty in the 15th to 16th century, such as this laminar style of arm protection called bifu or bishou, composed of overlapping metal plates. Though I gotta say, these shoulders are looking suspiciously European, like right out of the 14th to 15th centuries. You can take the fantasy tropes out of Europe, but you can't take the Europe out of fantasy tropes. These helmets are also fairly reminiscent of Ming examples, though this overall shape is common to many Eastern cultures throughout history. It's typically round and fitted to the skull with a vertical tube at the apex in which to house decorations like tassels, feathers, or sometimes even flags. The plumes of their Warhammer counterparts are obviously way more exaggerated than they would be in real life, but I get it. The models need to be a certain thickness for durability, and these shapes add a lot of movement and dynamism. I'll allow it. Now, an element I do want to spend a little more time on here is this big collar thing, which I would guess is inspired by the northern Chinese style of iron pagoda or iron Buddha armor from the Song and Great Qin dynasties. In the modern day, this style is commonly interpreted as full-body lamellar armor with this very distinctive collar protecting the neck and face, wrapping around the lower half of the helmet. However, I have a little bit of a beef with this design, which appears to me to be the result of somebody's modern interpretation rapidly proliferating on the internet to become the canonical representation. That's not to say that crazy beavers or gorgets did not exist in medieval East Asia, they just didn't really look like this. It is admittedly very difficult to find period sources from the 11th century, but we do have this particular painting from the Song dynasty, which I believe believe is the basis for most of the interpretations of this armor. Here we can see heavy cavalrymen indeed wearing some sort of protective covering over their faces. However, if you look closely, you'll see that this lamellar curtain, so to speak, does not actually seem to be a separate piece layering over the helmet, but rather an integrated piece attached to the helmet. In European parlance, I don't think we are looking at a bever, but something more like an aventail. We have further evidence for this integrated helmet theory by looking at some of the other figures in this painting. One guy appears to be wearing the helmet on his shoulder, like he's taken it off for a little bit of a breather. And here we can see that the lamellar elements do in fact seem to be attached to a solid skull cap, rather than a separate collar. Now, what is really interesting to me here is that I think I see where some of this misconception may have come from, because we have a Ming Dynasty reproduction of the exact same Song Dynasty painting some 100 or more years later. And you can see how in this reproduction they have introduced this bever as a separate element. What is fascinating to me is that this helmet and integrated back of the neck protection is a very Ming Dynasty style. So they clearly looked at the older illustration and then interpreted it through their modern lens of what their equipment looked like. You see European art doing very similar things, where when they're representing a historical battle in art, they will often dress the figures in a more or less contemporary style to their era, just maybe a few decades older, to evoke that sense of being out of date, but still being kind of wildly inaccurate as to what that original style would have looked like. I mean, they didn't have Google or Facebook groups full of special interest nerds meticulously cataloging sources, so it would have been extremely difficult for them to pinpoint a specific style in time, and they were just kind of guessing like, well, this looks kind of like my grandpa's armor. That's like old enough, right? So I think this is a great case study of how we have to be a bit careful with where we derive our historical inspiration. Experimental archaeology can be an excellent way to try to understand how original objects may have worked, but reproductions are not in and of themselves evidence of that interpretation's existence. Whenever possible, we have to go back to primary sources, because even historical secondary sources are still secondary sources. The Jade Lancers share a lot of equipment with the Jade Warriors, which actually makes a lot of sense. Historically speaking, Chinese mounted units were often not specialized in specific roles, but were expected to be able to variously deploy as mounted archers, shock cavalry, dragoons, or infantry. That said, I do find the conspicuous lack of bows in this set to be a little bit strange, since horse archery was such a major component of medieval Chinese warfare. But let's talk about the weapons they do have. I'm seeing a lot of large pole arms, which makes sense for the heaviness of this armor. As time goes on in Chinese history, armor gets lighter, and you see more spears and fewer giant axes or glaives accordingly, because they don't need to be able to chonk through as much material. And the shapes of these weapons are pretty similar to the illustrations we see in surviving military manuals of the Song and Ming dynasties. 我喜欢. Now, a detail I really like is that it seems as the rank of these units rises, from Jade Warrior to Jade Lancer to Gate Master to Longma Rider, the shapes of their blades gets fancier. I think this is a really smart design system, because while this very iconic glaive shape was real, it wasn't that common on the battlefield relative to simpler leaf-shaped spearheads. This particular shape is called the Yanyue Dao, or crescent blade, and it is often used in depictions of legendary heroes or gods, such as the deified Chinese general Guan Yu. So I love that this shape continues to connote prestige in this set. Now we gotta talk shoes. I know you can paint your army any color you want, but whoever painted these demo models was a very clever cookie, because the black boots with white soles are a very accurate Ming Dynasty fashion. You honor the ancestors, 大师. Silhouette-wise, these boots suggest a classically Mongolian or maybe Tibetan shape with this upturned toe. Chinese footwear also featured upturned toes throughout history, but their boots did tend to be flatter than those of neighboring horse cultures. To drop some boot lore on you, the European riding boots developed heels inspired by Persian cavalry to allow riders to stand in the stirrups without the foot slipping all the way through and getting caught. Asian riding boots achieved the same function by developing very wide shafts and short vamps, leading to this distinctive silhouette. With that detail in mind, I find that these boots look a little narrow at the ankle. 没有仔细. So now we gotta talk about the horsies. The horse armor in this set is a little bit of a mishmash of east and west. We've got the proper scale coats in the cataphract style, but then also plate patrils, cornets, and chamfrons, which is a little strange with the rest of this kit, because now we have evidence that the society can make plate armor. So why is this the only place that they're doing it? Scale would both be more period accurate and more appropriate, giving the material culture established by the rest of the kit. These plate components also suffer a bit from the fantasy trope of articulate everything everywhere, I would guess because it adds visual texture. I don't mind it so much in the petrol because that is a bit that flaps around a lot as a matter of course, but it doesn't make sense in the chanfron because the snout of the horse doesn't bend, so it doesn't need articulation. If you are going to add extra plates for reinforcement, the most important location to protect is the forehead between the eyes, so the layers should be stacked top to bottom rather than bottom to top, so that that vulnerable area gets 3 layers of protection rather than the tip of the snoot, which may be very smooshable, but is not where the brain is. We've covered a lot of the details here already in discussing the Jade Warriors and Jade Lancers, but I think the designers have done a really nice job of taking the same general shape of the lower ranking units and giving them some small elevated details to show their higher status. Unfortunately, that includes adding capes. Say no to capes. Just say no. But this additional ornamentation on the horse armor is very cool. The petrol is one piece now, which I like, and though the chanfron still really isn't made like Asian horse armor, the design once again conveys some nice draconic visual themes with the scales and wing-like or horn-like decorations. And they have a new shield, which is sort of a nonsensical shape. I don't really understand what this opening is meant to achieve, like maybe it's meant to be raised so that you can see through it while charging, but you don't need to do that because it is a handheld shield, and you can just lower it if you need to get visibility over it. The shields of the Jade Warriors and Lancers are actually pretty good, relatively speaking. Chinese shields tended to be round by the Song and Ming dynasty, but octagons are a culturally significant shape because of their similarity to feng shui bagua maps, and also the number 8 is just generally a very auspicious number in Chinese. Not to Chinese-splain to you, but it is a tonal language with relatively few consonant-vowel combinations, so there are a lot of homonyms. So because the word for 8, ba, sounds like the word for riches, fa, it is a very lucky number. You thought you were here for armor facts, but you got cultural puns instead. Anyways, these appear to be wooden shields strapped to the arm, which is quite appropriate for the overall Song dynasty-ish impression. Reinless riding was fairly common during this period to allow the second hand to support horse archery or a two-handed pole arm, rather than occupy that free hand with a center-gripped shield. And the symbol in the center of the shield has a real cultural basis as well. Traditional Chinese characters are commonly stylized into decorative circular motifs, and this is a fairly close interpretation of a familiar stylization of shou, which is the word for longevity. I actually love this design, and I'm gonna tell you why. Like I haven't been telling you things for 10 minutes already. This pattern here is what we call mountain armor today because these little interlocking triangular shapes look a bit like the Chinese word for mountain, and it is an incredibly mysterious style. Here's the problem. No extant examples of this armor exist, and we have no idea how it works. Modern experimental archaeology has failed to produce an armor that both looks like the sources and is actually functional, because it turns out that these little pits between the triangular pieces actually sort of guide arrows in, which is undesirable. But it's not just an artistic representation of male either, because we have sources that also feature what is clearly male alongside mountain armor. I've also seen some people claim that it is meant to represent some sort of culturally significant textile, and we do have very late Qing dynasty examples of this pattern on cloth. But based on the jagged, raised texture of the mountain armor representations we see in sculptures from earlier periods, I just don't buy that. Here's what we do know. This pattern is all over East Asian art, appearing in depictions of deities and legendary heroes for hundreds of years. So I think it is genuinely meant to be armor, but that it was perhaps always a fictional or purely ceremonial style that connoted power and prestige, given that it almost exclusively appears in depictions of mythical or extremely high status individuals. So the choice to use this style of armor on the Sentinels is so smart. It clearly yet wordlessly tells their origin story as living statues. We also see mountain armor in the design of the Shugengan Lord and even a bit on MiaoYing herself, so this design choice is very narratively consistent with its correlation to high status and proximity to magic. I love it. To speak a little further about our more fantastic fantastical units, I think the Shugengan Lord and his mount are downright majestic. The Longma, which is a name I'm pretty sure they got by smashing together dragon and horse in Chinese, vaguely resembles a Qilin, which is a deer-like mythical chimera creature that is sometimes referred to as a Chinese unicorn. The Qilin doesn't have these wings or fins, of course, but this is one case where I'm like, rule of cool all the way, man. It looks awesome. Let it be known that I love dragons independent of my heritage, but Chinese people really love dragons. The dragon has been a symbol of power and prosperity in China for thousands of years, at points even worshipped as a deity. Over time, it came to specifically represent imperial authority, so Grand Cathay's royal line being literally dragon folk is actually quite based in real cultural precedent. The Cathay dragon's shape-shifting ability also has basis in Chinese folklore, where dragons are frequently able to change their size, shape, and appearance, often taking human form to converse with and observe mortal beings. MiaoYing's dragon form does incorporate classic Asian elements such as the long snake-like body without wings, the flowing mane, and the whiskers. She's sharper in the face than many Chinese dragons are, but look, I draw my pedantry line at policing the beauty standards of mythical creatures. Though, I will say I find it highly disappointing that she only has 4 claws, because Chinese imperial dragons canonically have 5. While early depictions of dragons tended to have 3 claws, by the Yuan dynasty the dragon motif was codified such that only the emperor was permitted to wear the 5-clawed dragon. Commoners were explicitly forbidden from any clothing bearing the 5-clawed, 2-horned dragon, as well as other significant mythological creatures like the Qilin or phoenix. So while I know Cathay is not actually literally China, and other Eastern cultures have dragons with fewer toes, this could have been a really cool lore-deepening detail to include. Now I'm gonna be straight up here, I know next to nothing about Hanfu, so I'm going to leave her dress alone, except for that cape. But I will say that her dragon armor is cool. This is a fun way to interpret what a breastplate for a giant lizard beast might look like. Though I don't love how tall her hot pieces are. Like if she retracts her shoulders and moves her neck at the same time, there's going to be a sticky situation. But overall, super flavorful. I love me a dragon princess. So the Chinese invented gunpowder in the 9th century, fire arrows by the 10th century, gunpowder bombs by the 11th century, and hand cannons by the 13th century. So I find giant ogre man dragon-headed cannons in Grand Cathay entirely plausible. There were real Chinese rocket launchers that may have served as an inspiration for the Fire Rain rocket battery. Now our ogre friend here is wearing an interesting piece of protection variously called Krug or Charaina or just mirror armor, depending on the culture. It was a style most common in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and some parts of Asia, and is typified by a round disc in the center of the chest. While not inappropriate for a Chinese setting, it wasn't super common for Han soldiers, so I actually really like this choice for the ogre because it does set him culturally apart from the other models without feeling completely out of place. The human operators here appear to be wearing brigandine, which we can tell by the rivets in their coats that would be attaching metal plates to the back of the cloth. This style of armor is quite a bit later than the heavy scale armors we see on the other Cathay infantry, as brigandine armor is thought to have gained traction in the Chinese military around the 15th century. But they also have flying paper lanterns when the first hot air balloon was invented in 1783, so you know, I'll allow it. I actually really love this lantern dirigible. I think it's an absolutely adorable way to infuse real cultural objects with fantasy whimsy. What I think is also really cool is that you get the sense that the crew of this lantern are of a slightly different culture than the rest of the Cathayans, based on the style of their costume, which strikes me as slightly Middle Eastern flavored. I think this is actually a really nice detail because modern China has 56 officially recognized ethnic groups. The Han majority might be 91% of the population, while the next largest minority is the Zhuang people at 1.3%. But to put that in perspective, China is 1.4 billion people. So 1% is still 14 million people, which is larger than Belgium and like nearly 3 times Norway. So this little design detail is actually a nice subtle reminder that China, and by extension Cathay, contains multitudes. Overall, I really love this set. The artists have made some really smart decisions to add meaning to their designs by strategically drawing from real culture, neither being too slavish to history nor straying so far away as to lose the identity of the source that made it special in the first place. I think Grand Cathay is actually a really great example of how to blend fantasy and realism to create a respectful and most importantly, fun identity that remains distinctive on the table. As always, thank you so much for watching. I make content about history, fashion, and design with special interest in armor and material culture of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. So if that sounds like a good time to you, I hope you'll like and subscribe. Until next time, stay shiny.